Many people have preconceived ideas of what a migrant might look like. People tend to think that they're young, they've come here to look for work, they may be dependent on the welfare state, and they may be bringing their families with them, or indeed have large families. Our project used data from the 2011 census to look at the characteristics of EU migrants living in the UK to shed light on the debate. We found that 86% of those in the census were born in the UK, meaning just 14% were born outside of the UK. And looking at those born in the European Union, these constitute just 5% of the UK population in 2011, which is just around 2.5 million people. If we look at where those EU migrants have come from, just under half are coming from the countries of the new European Union. Those are the countries that joined after 2004. And just over half came from countries of the old EU. And if we look a little bit further, around a quarter of EU migrants were actually coming from Poland, making them the largest single group of EU migrants living in the UK. The second largest group was actually the Irish, constituting 16% of all EU migrants, and the third largest group were Germans. EU migrants tend to be younger than the UK-born population, and in fact 2/3 aged between 16 and 60, which is the prime working age groups. This, however, means that a smaller proportion are children or older people, those groups that we might think traditionally having a larger call on the welfare state. EU migrants are much more likely to be employed than UK-born people, with over 2/3 being employed. And when we look at the education of EU migrants, we actually find that they're much more highly educated than the UK-born population, with nearly 1/3 having a degree or higher professional qualification. And only 1/5, in fact 18% of EU migrants have no qualifications, compared with 24% of the UK-born population of the same age group. Employment and education don't necessarily transform into a higher socioeconomic group, and in fact a lower proportion of EU migrants own their own home than UK-born population, and they're 4 times more likely to be renting from the private sector. As a demographer, we were really interested in the family position of EU migrants. And EU migrants tend to be they're younger, and a higher proportion tend to be single than the UK-born population. But amongst those who are partnered, 1/3 are partnered with a UK-born partner. And of these, 1/3 have children. This has implications for these families going forward. What will it mean for these families in a post-Brexit world? Will these families be able to stay together, or what will their options be? Will the UK-born partner choose to leave the UK to stay with their EU partner and their children? These are issues that we'll be looking into in greater detail going forward.
So the first part of the question is, can we really predict migration? And the answer is barely. So in the United Kingdom, 30 years ago, migration balance was negative, so more people were leaving the country than coming into it. And at that time, the assumptions that people made about migration was that this state of affairs will continue into the foreseeable future. And as we know, it was completely wrong. But similarly, the current high migration flows in the UK are very unlikely to continue forever. So the other question then is, can we control migration? And of course, to some extent, yes. There are many government instruments that can help do this. But to think that we can control it fully and that we have full control over it, it's a comfortable illusion. There are many drivers of migration. There are many vested interests, sometimes conflicting interests in migration. Many sectors of the economy are reliant on migrant labor. For that reason, it's very difficult to reconcile all these conflicting interests. So we need to realize that migration is not like a tap that can be turned on and off at any moment. And what can go wrong here? What can go wrong with attempts to control migration? So first of all, there can be many unintended consequences of any policies that we can think of implementing. Raising barriers to legal migration can lead to switching from short-term circulatory movements to more longer-term or illegal migration, like it was the case in the United States. Selective border enforcement, as in the case of European asylum crisis, can lead to increasing the price, increasing the risks associated with migration, and also increasing to the rise of the crime syndicates, as in the case of human smuggling. So what can be done? First of all, we really need to acknowledge the whole complexity of migration. It's unlikely that any simple blunt policy instruments will work. And in any case, they won't satisfy all the vested and conflicting interests in migration that there are in modern economies. What we also need is a discussion about contingency planning, about risks, about costs, but also about benefits. So what is currently missing from the debate of migration is the question how to harness the potential, how to harness the benefits of migration for the greater good. And this, along with the question of how to look at migration in its whole complexity, is one of the biggest challenges that we are faced with today.
In short, EU migrants come to the UK to work, they make a positive economic contribution, and they use the benefit system to help them integrate into the UK labour market and to cover the risks that are involved in that process. Our research suggests that the cuts that have already been made has had a significant impact. If further cuts were made, that would obviously make the situation more difficult for those EU migrants who come to the UK seeking to make an economic contribution. The question then is, well, is that something that should concern economic policymakers in the UK? Our contention is that it should concern them. If EU migrants face a more risky situation in the UK with regard to integrating into the labour market than, say, other countries in the EU, then what that will mean is that the UK could lose out in the race for talent to those other EU countries. Of course, it might seek to compensate for the loss of EU migrants by increasing migration from elsewhere in the world, but that obviously raises a number of important issues by itself. So, should the UK cut benefits to migrants after leaving the EU? The obvious answer might well be yes, but we would suggest that it runs a risk of incurring quite significant economic costs if it chooses to go down that particular route.
Today I want to talk about how well equipped are UK households to sustain their standards of living through the period of 2006 to 2012 that comprises the advent of the 2007 financial crisis. And in particular, I want to compare how do UK native households do relative to UK migrant households. The good news is that by 2012, UK households were wealthier than they were in 2006. When we compare UK households, natives with UK migrant households, what we see is that UK natives were and have remained richer all through the period. Turning now to the effect of the crisis on household earnings, what we see is that earnings fluctuated disproportionately all through the period, and particularly so for UK migrant households. Furthermore, by 2012, the earnings of both UK and EU migrant households were below their levels in 2006. Only the earnings of non-EU migrant households were higher by 2012 than what they were by 2006. It would therefore appear that the ability of UK native households to sustain their standards of living is related to their earnings having been less affected by the crisis. However, the earnings of UK migrant households have been disproportionately affected, and particularly so those of EU migrant households, the level of which by 2012 was also below their 2006 level. What would be the implication of Brexit given the results of our research then? Well, if Brexit were to mean less EU migrants, one would expect that the impact of a future economic crisis on the standards of living of UK households would be bigger through their amplified effect on their earnings.
Understanding the costs and benefits of migration is a big and important question. Economists have been trying to do so by looking at objective measures such as wages or employment and asking questions such as, is immigration reducing the wages of natives, or is immigration or immigrants taking up the jobs of natives? Some other economists have looked at how immigration influences house prices, or whether migrants and migration itself is increasing the public expenditure. However, this type of questions allows only to have a partial understanding on how important the effects of migration are. We start wondering as economists on whether immigration is also affecting other outcomes, actually less tangible outcomes such as happiness, well-being, mental health, and life satisfaction. So part of my research has been devoted to try to ask this question in a country such as Germany, which is a high immigration country. The results of my research for Germany showed that a higher number of migrants in a region and a more diverse set of migrants in the regions influence positively the happiness of natives in Germany. The big question, of course, is whether this is also the case for the UK. There is no current research showing the association between migration and happiness of British people, or migration and the mental well-being of British people. And considering the importance the mental well-being and in general happiness has for the policy agenda of this country, I just wonder on whether reducing migration in the UK will actually incur in a decrease of happiness of British people.
recently, we conducted an EU Migrant pre-Brexit survey. So in the weeks and months preceding Brexit, we conducted a survey, and almost 2,000 migrants responded to and completed this survey. And one of the major questions we asked was, will EU migrants decide to stay in the UK or leave the UK as a consequence of a potential Brexit? We found that the vast majority of EU migrants who completed our survey said that they would, or they intended to stay in the UK. A follow-up question we asked was, would they apply for one of the civic integration mechanisms, either a permanent residence certificate, or would they actually apply for British citizenship in the future? The vast majority of EU migrants who said they plan to stay in the UK said that they would consider a permanent residence certificate or applying for British citizenship at some point in the future. When we followed up with further questions about the time frame, the vast majority of people said that they would apply for British citizenship or a permanent residence certificate within 5 years. When we asked further questions about what were some of the factors involved in the decision-making processes about potentially applying for EU UK citizenship, the cost of the applications came up, obviously, and the amount of time involved. It's a very time-consuming and costly process. But some other factors came up in terms of where other members of extended families of migrants living in the UK, were they also applying for citizenship, or did they already have permanent residence? So what we found, and research, especially my own research on Polish migrants to the UK, is that there's a transplantation of intimate networks in many cases amongst migrant groups. So migrants just don't, especially EU migrants, don't just immigrate as individuals. They're not just circular individual migrants. In many cases, they're migrating with or forming relationships with partners in the UK. They also bring or have children here. And sometimes, in my own findings on Polish migrants in particular, they actually migrate or with or follow their close friends and close family members. So there's a transplantation of intimate relationships. So if your sister or brother or parents, etc., or your children, if you have grown-up children, are going to be applying for a permanent residence certificate and potentially British citizenship, you might also consider applying for these things just so that the family can stay together. So this is a major consideration, a major finding from our project. It wasn't just your gender, your age, your economic position, your employment status that impacted on whether you would apply for British citizenship or not. It was also these social and familial factors too.